ever since I was a kid, I've been moved, awed, and at times even gobsmacked by the power and magic of words. And I can even remember the exact moment that I was hooked. It was my dad who did it to me. Now, my siblings and I were Army brats, living on post in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. My father, a Special Forces Green Beret infantry captain at the time, would often come home late, right from the field, still decked out in his camouflage fatigues. In contrast to most other families, it was our dad who read us to sleep. He'd turn off our bedroom lights, flick on his military-issue field flashlight, you know, the kind with a 90-degree bend, with a red lens over the bulb, which lent his face an eerie glow as he began telling his stories. Now, this particular night, we were reading J.R.R. Tolkien's classic fantasy trilogy, The Lord of the Rings. And in a passage describing one of our favorite characters, the wise wizard Gandalf the Grey, he read, "The last thing that Pippin saw as sleep took him was a dark glimpse of the old wizard huddled on the floor, shielding a glowing chip in his gnarled hands between his knees." I can still remember my dad saying, "Gnarled, the perfect word. It even sounds like what it means. Listen again." And as he so often did, he read the sentence again, savoring the word gnarled this time. "What's gnarled mean?" we asked. We were hooked. Twisted and knotted. Can't you just picture this ancient sorcerer with knotted, twisted hands like this, lighting his pipe? My dad acted out Gandalf huddled over, lighting an imaginary pipe, using his flashlight as the glowing chip. We went on to discuss other twisted and knotty things, like branches and ropes. And then my dad challenged us. See how many gnarled things you can find tomorrow, and tell me at dinner. The next day, I had an epiphany. I saw gnarled tree trunks, gnarled branches, even a woman's gnarled features as she screwed up her face at her unruly kids in the grocery store. How did so many gnarled things suddenly pop up overnight? Now, I tell you this story because it demonstrates the power of words to change how we see the world. Of course, gnarled things had always been there, but it took me learning a word to really see those things for myself. A word made all the difference. So when people ask me, why should I spend my time and effort improving my vocabulary? Do words really matter? Well, as my story illustrates, I definitely believe that they do. And not only because learning new words like gnarled can give us joy and even change our very perception of the world. I also know the practical value of developing a rich vocabulary. Indeed, our ability to use vocabulary effectively is one of the primary means by which we communicate and connect with the important people in our lives, our colleagues at work, our family and friends, and even the wider world. Choosing the just right word adds precision and clarity to our speech and our writing. Words are tools we use to inform, advise, persuade, and reason. Words really do matter. But where do we start? I mean, there are so many words to learn and so little time. Well, what we really need is a structured approach, a framework that we can use for a lifetime of vocabulary learning. And that's exactly what I'm going to give you today. I'm going to identify 5 core principles for building and using a rich vocabulary. And if you honor these principles and the strategies that arise from them, you'll have an efficient method for harnessing the power of the English language. Now, before I enumerate these principles, however, let's explore an important general concept in vocabulary learning, the dimmer switch phenomenon. Okay, now learning words is not an all or nothing affair, as though one moment we've never heard a word before and then, bang, immediately after looking it up in the dictionary, we become an expert user of that word. That would be like flipping a light switch from off to on. A better metaphor that vocabulary researchers Camille Blackowitz and Peter Fisher use is the dimmer switch. Now, my own family has a dimmer switch in our dining room, and we can gradually increase the amount of light that we want. This is how vocabulary learning works, gradually and incrementally. First, we learn the dictionary definition of a word. Then gradually we become more comfortable with how that word is used in various contexts as we try it out ourselves. So to give you a more concrete sense of this dimmer switch phenomenon, I'm going to say 3 vocabulary words out loud in a few moments, and I'm going to ask you to rate your knowledge of each word on a vocabulary knowledge scale. Now, this scale is from the work of educational researchers Edgar Dale and Joseph O'Rourke, who proposed 4 levels of word knowledge. So on the scale, a rating of 1 means I do not know the word and I have never seen it before. A rating of 2 means I've heard the word before, but I'm not sure what it means. A rating of 3 means I know the word and can recognize and understand it while reading, but probably wouldn't feel comfortable using it in writing or speech. And a rating of 4 means I know the word well and I can use it in writing and speech. Okay, that's the scale. Now here are the 3 vocabulary words. Rate your knowledge of each as a 1, 2, 3, or 4. The first word is ambitious. Rate your knowledge of ambitious. The second word is factotum. Rate your knowledge of factotum. The third word is procrustean. Rate your knowledge of procrustean. What was your rating for each word? Now, I've used this activity a number of times, and most people rate ambitious as a 4. They feel they can use this word comfortably in speech and writing. Most people rate factotum a little lower, possibly a 2 or a 3. They've heard the word factotum before, but beyond a general sense of it referring to a person, wouldn't feel comfortable using it in speech. However, these people could probably figure out the word's meaning in supportive context. And most people rate procrustean as a 1. They've never heard the word before. Now, before we dig into the meanings of these words, let's discuss what this activity shows us. Like a dimmer switch gradually growing brighter, our knowledge of words is not an all or nothing affair. Or to use a different metaphor, some words, those we rate as 4, are like our good friends. We feel comfortable with them. We've known them a long time. Some words, the ones we rate as 2s or 3s, are acquaintances. We know them, but not really well. And some words, the ones, are complete strangers. So as you learn new words throughout this course, remember the dimmer switch metaphor. Don't feel that you have to master them immediately like an on-off switch. It may take some time and practice before you feel that you're comfortable with a new word, just as it may take a while for a complete stranger to become a close friend. In fact, we know from vocabulary research that it takes multiple exposures across many different contexts before we really start to know a word. For example, one study found that school-age students needed 12 encounters with a word to make a difference in their comprehension of a passage containing that word. So, now that we appreciate the dimmer switch phenomenon, what are those 5 principles I mentioned a moment ago? The principles of effective vocabulary learning. Well, why don't we use one of the words that we just encountered to introduce these principles in a very practical way? Let's explore the word factotum as an example of best practices in vocabulary learning. Best practices that we'll use throughout this course. So first, let's start with a clear definition. A factotum is someone hired to do a variety of jobs, someone who has many different responsibilities, a jack of all trades. Second, place the word factotum in context. How might factotum sound in a sentence? Tessa, the office factotum, does the billing, answers the phones, fills in the PR department, and even knows how to bake a mean blueberry scone. She's indispensable. Okay, third, make connections to the word. What are some examples of a factotum? A factotum might be a general handyman around the house, someone that you hire to do a variety of odd jobs, from plumbing to fixing a window to painting a room. Now, when I think of factotum, I think of Alfred the Butler. If you've ever seen the Batman movies or read the comic books, you know Alfred. Alfred does it all. He's more than Bruce Wayne's butler. He's also the expert mechanic for the Batmobile, Batplane, and Batcopter. He keeps Batman's personal affairs in order as a sort of secretary, and he even offers Batman sage advice from time to time. His counselor. Wouldn't we all love to have an Alfred in our lives? Do you know someone like this? How about moms? Moms are factotums, aren't they? And have you ever met or worked with someone who is a jack of all trades like this? Now here's what I want you to do. Picture the word factotum next to this person's face. Make a personal connection with that vocabulary word. So, you've defined the word, you've used it in a sentence, and even made a personal connection. But how can you remember this word so you don't forget it 3 weeks from now? Now, I remember the first time I read the word factotum in a book during college. The context was not rich enough to help me figure out the meaning. So feeling motivated that day, I looked it up in a dictionary. But then I didn't see factotum again for many years, not until after college. And at that point, I couldn't remember what the word meant. I was frustrated because I knew I'd spent time looking the word up years before, but it hadn't stuck in my long-term memory. Sound familiar? However, in between my two factotum encounters, I learned one of the secrets to vocabulary acquisition, which brings me to our fourth principle of vocabulary learning. You see, I've been taking graduate literacy education courses at the University of Virginia and learned that a little knowledge of morphology, our language's system of meaning, can help us better remember a word's meaning and make it our own. So this time, I took the time to look deeper into the word and found out that the root, fac, which begins factotum, is from the Latin verb facio, meaning to make or do. So what other English words do you know that start with fac? How about factory? Factories make things, and people in factories do things. They're busy places. Factory became my key word for the root fac. The meaning of the key word, factory, helped me remember the meaning of the root fac. So whenever I see the Latin root fac in a word, I think of my key word factory and suspect that the word might have something to do with making or doing. Now the Latin word totum, the second part of factotum, means all and is the source for the English word total. So, a factotum is someone who does everything. Factotums literally do it all. And if you remember factotum this way, you'll never forget it again. 3 weeks, 3 months, or even 3 years from now. So, do you feel like you know factotum pretty well now? What did we do to make this word so memorable? We followed 4 principles of vocabulary learning that we'll be using throughout this course. Definitions, context, connections, and morphology. First, for each target word, I'll provide you with a clear definition that distills the critical aspects of what a word means, and just as importantly, what it does not mean. Second, I'll place each target word in the context of a sentence, so you can actually get a feel for how it's actually used. Now remember, words were born and live in context, not in vocabulary books or lists. If you really want to study a shark, you study it in the ocean, its natural habitat. If you want to really know a word, you study how it behaves in its natural habitat, sentences, paragraphs, and books. Now third, I'll make connections to the word and ask you to do the same. In the example that I cited before, I connected the word factotum to Alfred, Batman's butler. Think of a vocabulary word as a label for an underlying concept. You already knew the basic concept of factotum. I mean, we all know someone who does a little bit of everything, but you may not have had the label, the word factotum. We connected the new word or label to your known concept. Now, in my 2 decades in education, This is one of the most powerful learning principles that I know, connecting the new to the known. So throughout this course, I'll be making new to known connections, and more importantly, asking you to make personal connections to the words we're learning. You'll connect our target words to people you know, experiences you've had, and things you've read, so you can make the words your own. And because you'll be actively making the connections, you'll be the one in charge of your own learning. The more connections you make, the more actively engaged you are, the more likely you are to make the word your own. Now, our fourth principle of vocabulary learning is to explore a word's morphology. Morphology is the study of the structure of words, including meaningful word parts like prefixes, suffixes, and roots, and patterns and processes of word formation. Our morphological system in English can be an incredibly powerful system for learning vocabulary, if you know how to tap into it. Now, to remember the word factotum, we broke it down by the meaningful parts of the word, the Latin root fac, and the second part totum. We call meaning parts like these, such as Latin and Greek roots, morphemes. Exploring a word's morphological structure, or as I like to say, taking the root back to the root, is a powerful and greatly underutilized vocabulary learning tool. Okay, that's 4 of our 5 vocabulary learning principles: definition, context, connections, and morphology. Before we move to the 5th principle, how about that word Procrustean? Let's start with the definition. Procrustean means tending to produce conformity by arbitrary, ruthless, or violent means. Let's put Procrustean in context. Even though the student's poem unanimously won the all-county writing contest, the Procrustean English teacher gave her an F for failing to dot the I in her name. Ouch! That's a pretty ruthless way of enforcing conformity. Now, let's make a personal connection. Have you ever met someone who's completely inflexible? Someone who tries to make things fit, even if they don't? You know the type. They love Robert's Rules of Order. They probably carry it around in their back pockets. They're sticklers for procedures, rules, and regulations. A boss? A coworker? Maybe a family member who, once you've made a plan for the day, refuses to make even a small change? Then you know someone who's Procrustean. Make a personal connection. And please try to follow procedures and not make any sudden changes of plan around this Procrustean person. Now, Procrustean comes from Greek mythology. Procrustes was a mythical bandit of Attica who would waylay hapless travelers and attempt to fit them to his iron bed. If you were too long for the bed, he'd cut your feet off. And if you were too short for the bed, he'd stretch you out. Delightful gentleman, huh? Procrustes is not the kind of guy you'd like to have over for dinner to meet mom. And a Procrustean bed has come to mean an arbitrary standard to which something is forced to conform. Now, I just told you an etymological narrative about Procrustean. The etymology of a word is its history, including its origin, its evolution, and its spread to other languages, and its shift in meaning and form over time. And a narrative is a story. So, an etymological narrative is a story about the history of a word. And I like to tell word stories, not just because they're incredibly interesting, but because they help us remember words. As cognitive psychologist Daniel T. Willingham notes, our minds are hardwired to remember stories. This is why we generally find it easier to remember stories that people tell us than information presented in a non-story format, like facts in a science textbook. When we learn etymological narratives or stories about the history of words, we leverage one of the most powerful vocabulary learning tools that we know. And a big part of a word's etymology or history is its morphology, including the Latin or Greek roots from which it sprang. So, we'll be exploring the word's etymology and morphology, its history and its structure together throughout this course. So, we already have 4 important principles or tools in our learning toolbox. But once we've used these principles to learn dozens or even hundreds of new words, what do we do with all these words? How do we organize them in a way that actually makes sense? How do we store these words in our mental lexicon, in our mental library of word meanings, so that when we need to retrieve them and actually use them, we know where to find them? This brings me to our 5th vocabulary learning principle. Word learning should be structured. And indeed, the best structure for learning new words is one that reflects the way that our brain naturally organizes and stores information. So to illustrate this, let's conduct a little memory experiment. I'm going to read a list of 12 words aloud. When I'm done, I'm going to ask you to repeat them. If you're able, pause the lecture at that point and try to repeat or write down as many of the words as you can remember. Don't write anything down just now, just listen and try to remember. Okay, are you ready? Here we go. Enchilada, soccer, Louis Armstrong, football, burrito, Dizzy Gillespie, hockey, Glenn Miller, taco, lacrosse, Oscar Peterson, fajita. Okay, now press pause and repeat or write as many words as you can. How many words could you remember? How many were you absolutely sure of? How many did you say, but were uncertain if they were even on the list? Okay, now we're going to try this experiment one more time with one small exception. I'm going to read the same list of items aloud. However, I'm going to read them in a different order. And at the end, press pause if you can, and try to repeat or write down as many of the words as you can remember. Okay, ready? Here we go. Mexican foods, enchilada, burrito, taco, fajita. Sports, soccer, football, hockey, lacrosse. Jazz greats, Louis Armstrong, Dizzy Gillespie, Glenn Miller, Oscar Peterson. Now, hit pause and recite or write down as many as you can. So how did it go? How many words could you remember this time? Now, I've done this memory experiment many times with many different audiences and nearly always come up with the same results. During the first test, when I read the words aloud randomly, most people experience difficulty remembering all the words and even become a little overwhelmed. In fact, even the people with the best memories usually can only remember about 7 words the first time. And this is consistent with memory research that shows that we only have a limited amount of working memory in which we can store information in the short term. Colleagues I've worked with call this difficulty remembering randomly presented information the mental junk drawer phenomenon. Do you have a junk drawer at home? What's in it? Little pencil nubs with no erasers? Pens with no ink? Keys that you don't even know what they open? Menus for defunct restaurants? I mean, why do we put things in the junk drawer? Well, either we're too lazy to put them away where they belong, or we don't have a place to store them. Isn't it hard to find something in that junk drawer when you need it? It's all jumbled up. It's the same way with words. When we just try and cram vocabulary words into our mental junk drawer, without any organizational scheme, we'll have a hard time finding them when we actually need them. And that's why most people find it a lot easier to remember words in this memory experiment the second time around. It's not just because they had a second time to practice them. It's because the words were organized or chunked into 3 meaningful categories. When we chunk items of information by meaningful categories, we're better able to remember them. In a sense, we don't have to remember 12 items anymore. We only have to remember 3 categories, a much easier load on the memory. This idea of chunking vocabulary items is our 5th core learning principle, and it's related to a well-known concept in education and cognitive science, schema theory. Now, according to schema theory, we organize and categorize knowledge by abstract mental frameworks or structures, called schema. Think of schema as mental file folders in which we organize information. This is how we can keep track of so much information in our brains and avoid the pitfalls of the mental junk drawer. So if you say the word baseball, my schema would include my favorite team, the Philadelphia Phillies, the smell of a leather baseball glove, the taste of Cracker Jack, and some of my all-time favorite players such as Roberto Clemente and Cal Ripken Jr. Now, compare the chunking technique that we just learned about with the traditional approach to vocabulary instruction that many of us experienced in our schooling. Now, while I was incredibly fortunate to have many absolutely outstanding teachers throughout my life, I don't have overly fond memories of the way that I was taught vocabulary in high school. See if my experiences sound familiar to you. Each Monday, our class was given 30 to 40 new vocabulary words to study, all organized alphabetically. Words like baleful, ballyhoo, bastion, and bedlam. Wonderful words, but all in the same list simply because they all happen to fall under the same letter in the dictionary. B. We would memorize the words for the Friday test and forget half of them by the following Monday. Why? Because we were trying to memorize these words by rote, stuffing them into our mental junk drawer, not making connections among them, and certainly not organizing them by the way our minds worked. The words were not organized by schema or chunked by common meaning. So, how should we organize vocabulary words? Well, let's take the word kerfuffle, which means a commotion, disorder, controversy, or fuss. Wouldn't it make sense to examine kerfuffle alongside related words like imbroglio, melee, hullabaloo, tussle, Donnybrook, and spat? If this was our list for the week, we'd not only study the common meaning they all shared, a type of disagreement or fight, but, just as importantly, we would examine the finer shades of distinction and nuances of meaning among these words, exploring which words implied a more violent, serious confrontation, like a Donnybrook or a melee, and which referred to a gentler disturbance, like a tussle or spat. If we organize a vocabulary learning by meaning, honoring the way our brain works will dramatically improve our chances of remembering and using these words. Now, we refer to organizing words by meaning like this as semantic chunking. In this way, when we go to retrieve the word that we want, we'll know where we stored it in the first place, instead of going on a wild goose chase for the word in our mental junk drawer. So there you have it, the 5 core principles of effective vocabulary learning: definition, context, connections, morphology, and semantic chunking. Together, these principles give us a solid foundation for building a better vocabulary. Now, I'd like to conclude today with one of my favorite etymological narratives. It's the history behind the word decimate. Now, we know that decimate means to utterly destroy something, but where did decimate come from? If we do a little morphological analysis, we find the root dec from the Latin word decum at the beginning of this word. What other words do we know that share the same root? Decade, decimal, and decathlon all share the core meaning of 10. So what does the number 10 have to do with decimating or utterly destroying something? Well, during the time of ancient Rome, while the Roman legions were out conquering much of the known world, mutiny was a big concern for the military command. Soldiers who had been away from home for years, living, fighting, and dying under incredibly harsh conditions, might start talking about rebellion. And if a Roman general got wind of a mutiny, he would select 1/10 of the mutinous soldiers by lot to be killed. So, the original meaning of the word decimate was literally to kill 1/10. Over time, as so often happens, the meaning of this word shifted and changed to the more general meaning of utterly destroying something. Pretty interesting, huh? And that's the point. When we dig into the history of words like decimate, we discover that learning vocabulary doesn't have to be the dry, deadly set of exercises that many of us experienced in school. It can be stimulating as well as enlightening. Words can change how you see the world. In Shakespeare's classic tragedy, Romeo and Juliet, Juliet asks, "What's in a name?" As a lifelong learner of vocabulary, I'm constantly asking myself a related question: what's in a word? I believe that with a little curiosity and knowledge about how words work, the answer is almost always a lot.